The intersection of endurance sport, health, fitness, and life. Challenging conventional ideas and empowering people with the science of self-propelled motion. This is the Endurance Experience Podcast, hosted by Tony Rich.
Welcome to this second season of the Endurance Experience Podcast. That last season is going to be pretty hard to top. Some amazing guests there, and if you haven't listened to all those episodes, I highly recommend you go back and take a listen. For this second season, I have some awesome guests lined up. And my guest in this podcast certainly does not disappoint, so I'm going to get right into the introduction. I have a conversation with Hunter Allen. Hunter is widely known as one of the top experts in the world in coaching endurance athletes using power meters. He's the founder of Peaks Coaching Group and co-founder of the Trainingpeaks software. He's traveled to over 20 countries and taught thousands of cycling coaches and riders the principles of power training. He's a level 1 certified coach with USA Cycling. He was the 2008 BMX technical coach for the Beijing Olympics, and he's taught the USA Cycling Power Certification course since 2005. Hunter was a former professional cyclist on the Navigators team. He's been coaching endurance athletes since 1995, and some of those athletes have achieved more than 2,000 victories and numerous national and world championships, and even some Olympic medals. Hunter is known as the coach's coach, and frequently has coaches from around the world consulting with him to learn more about the latest in cycling and triathlon training principles. And I can certainly attest to being a coach's coach because he certainly taught me a lot, particularly through his book that he's co-authored with Dr. Andy Coggan, the exercise physiologist, Training and Racing with a Power Meter, which is now in its third edition. I highly recommend this book for all endurance athletes. I'll put the link to it in the show notes. But this book really taught me a lot and took me into new direction. And when I scheduled the podcast with Hunter, I took the book off the shelf and took a little trip down memory lane, because inside this book I have things highlighted, underlined, pages dog-eared, things scribbled in the margins. I mean, this was mainly the source of material when I started to become a coach, and it really helped solidify particularly with cycling, what you need to do to train with a purpose versus just training. And training with a power meter will help you do that. But all the work that Hunter Allen has done and Dr. Andy Coggan has done, it really is the foundation of everything that we're doing today, right? So when they founded Trainingpeaks and WKO4 and now WKO5, this really took the whole industry into a new direction. We're still using the data science today. And prior to this, coaches and coach athletes were basically just using spreadsheets still using perceived effort. You know, some people were using heart rate monitors, and power meters were just growing in popularity. So the work they pioneered really helped us make sense of it all. This podcast is going to be very helpful if you're a triathlete or a cyclist, whether beginner or experienced, and you just want to get some more understanding on how to become a better cyclist and train with a purpose. And so I put some links into the show notes to familiarize some of the listeners with the lexicon that we're using, TSS or Training Stress Score, and the components of the PMC, the Performance Management Chart, ATL, CTL, and TSB. So, without further delay, I give you Hunter Allen. I am on with Hunter Allen. Thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Oh, Tony, great to be here. Thank you. I'm glad to share some thoughts.
Excellent. So, many people know Hunter Allen and his collaboration with Dr. Andy Coggan. And when we decided to sit down for the podcast, I went over to my bookshelf and pulled off a book that I've had for several years, Training and Racing with a Power Meter. And this book really took me into new direction, both as a self-coached athlete and then when I became coached. I to this day continue to use it as a reference. And so you guys are on the now third edition of that book, is that right?
That's correct. So March of this year, 2019, our third edition came out, and it's been kind of crazy that we've had 10 years between editions, and it's like, whoa, oh my gosh, how did that happen? 10 years.
Right. So let's first just to familiarize the listeners with you and your collaborative efforts with Dr. Andy Coggan and how you came to collaborate, your background, and everything about how things like, the collaboration with
Sure.
you guys in WKO came about and everything like that, just to give some color to our listeners.
Oh, absolutely. So, it's a really, really fun story, and I enjoy sharing it. And I've been very, very fortunate to have lots of amazing clients over the years that I've worked with, and you never know what's going to happen. And this was one of those scenarios where a client came to me back in 99, 98. I can't remember, maybe the end of 98. Kevin Williams, and Kevin came to me and said, "Hey, I want you to coach me, and I've got one of these power meter thingies, and would you coach me with it?" And I was like, "Well, I guess I've never had a power meter when I was a pro cyclist," and so I said, "Well, I'll try. I'll do my best, and we'll see. We'll figure it out." So he sent me a copy of the software at the time that was called Power Link from Cyclops, and then he started sending me the files by email every day of what this data looked like, and it was just kind of a squiggly line on a graph and I really didn't know what that meant. So I realized really quickly, if I'm going to really understand this, I need to understand it for myself. From I need to have a relationship with that data, and that's something that I think all of us really need anytime we have, especially this biometric data where we're capturing that for ourselves. I think it's really, really difficult to understand that if you're not using it. You don't have a relationship yourself. So I got a power meter. It was one of the really old, big monster gray power tap hubs. Thing weighed like 4 pounds, and but I started training again with it, and I had retired from pro cycling at the time, and I was like, I need to go out and just train again, do my old hill repeats, do everything that I did when I was a pro to learn what it meant. Is 400 watts good? Is 300 watts? What does all that stuff meant? So we started training with it. I started to get a relationship with it that helped me to coach him. And then in the year 2000, Sam Callan, USA Cycling, started or created the first ever power seminar in Philadelphia and around the big race there. the pro championships at the time. And so we went, and Dr. Coggin was there, Dr. Al Lim was there, who's the founder of Scratch Labs, and then Dean Golich was there, who's been a longtime coach for the U.S. national team and has been working with Carmichael Training Systems forever as well. So they presented, and they presented some really compelling information, but the theme of the three of them was we don't have software to understand this data. We don't know how to really understand it fully. And Kevin is just the savant programmer, and so he was like, over lunch, like, man, I can build this software. I can build it. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, that's what I do. I build software. Like, I can build software, and we could do this. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah. So let's do it. And so we started working on Trainingpeaks software, and that was the desktop software that we started working on. And 2003, we launched it, and in that process, we brought Andy in, and because we were seeing, we created a dialogue with Andy, and we started to see these trends and started to see things that nobody else ever considered, and because we were looking at this new way to visualize software and charts and graphs, and I'm not an exercise physiologist. So I was like, well, I think there's something here. Hey, Andy, does this actually relate to, something within our exercise physiology, within the scientific literature, or is this just whatever? I'm just, trying to read the matrix here.
Right.
So he was instrumental in being a part of, that confirmation of ideas, and then also, helping to guide a lot of the way that we visualize some of that as well, and starting to bring some of those ideas forth. And I came to him one day, and kind of as a coach, the holy grail of coaching, right? The holy grail of coaching is when an athlete comes to you and says, all right, Hunter, all right, Tony, I want to peak on May 15th.
Right.
Like, that's my goal, right? Like that's the goal, right? And so the holy grail is creating that peak of fitness, right? Creating that perfect day on May 15th when the stars, the moon, sun, everything aligns. They're flying that day. They wake up, they're super energized. Everything is perfect, and it goes that way. Now, we know life intervenes sometimes, and you get a flat tire in the first 5 miles, right, or whatever. Life intervenes. But to put that athlete in a position to have their peak performance, that's the holy grail of coaching. Because anybody can give somebody a training plan, a structured training plan, if they've never done a structured training plan before. Then they just go and do it,
right,
and they get better, right? But the holy grail, again, is to create that peak when the athlete wants it. And so, that was something that I said, wow, we have now the ability with a power meter to understand and quantify all of our training load, right? We can understand exactly second by second what happens from a training load perspective. And so I need a score. And I went to Andy and I talked to him. I was like, man, I need a score. I need a way to score these workouts so that we can quantify the training load, and then I can work backwards so that I will be able to actually peak an athlete based on math, so that I can statistics, so that I could see exactly when to taper them, how much load they can handle, all these things. And he said, oh, well, okay, well, let me think about it. And, 2 weeks later, he calls me up on the phone and says, Eureka!
Right.
Classic scientist, right? I've got it, right? And I'm like, okay, what do you got? And he said, I've got your score. It's going to be called Training Stress Score, and it's built on this work by Bannister on TRIMPS, Training Impulse. And he created this score back in the day, and heart rate. And we're going to use it with power, and I've got some derivations and make it even better. And that's going to, we're going to use, and the critical piece was where there are two critical pieces of that. One, he created normalized power, and that's power that you produce when you pedal if you pedaled smoothly, right? So if we're pedaling over and up and down a bunch of hills and stuff, then what happens? How does your body feel if you pedaled smoothly that entire time? And then he also incorporated the intensity, which is called the intensity factor.
Yep.
How intense the effort was as a relationship to your threshold power. And you get more points if you go over threshold, less points if you go under threshold. Those are two critical things. So that was really how training stress score got created. And that just sent us down this path then to create other tools like the performance manager chart,
right?
And things that now are ubiquitous in training with Power Meter.
Yeah, exactly. And so you guys were really the first movers on this. And so if you fast forward to today, now there's wearable technology. There is people are looking at even AI and cloud computing, getting all of the data into the cloud, and then creating applications to figure out what to do with that data, what that means for either the human body or an athlete, and drawing logical conclusions from cause to effect. That's a big thing right now. You guys were really the first ones to really move on this, and now everybody's trying to do the same thing. It's pretty fascinating. So we'll get into the score, and because
sure.
The listeners definitely want to know how to interpret some of that. But I think what you're saying is that the value proposition for the cyclist or a triathlete to use power is that it's giving you a way to draw logical conclusions from cause to effect on your training effort and what you need to do in order to improve as a cyclist. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. It's the we've moved from two different things. One, the purely subjective way of training, like how do I train and I feel like I'm training hard, right? Or I feel like I'm tired, and to an objective place of saying, oh wow, you're really not training that hard. You need to train more intensely. You need to push yourself even more. Or you're not training in the correct energy system. You're not eliciting the correct training stress to improve this energy system. And then we moved from this response training. We've had heart rate monitors, which are still really important. I still wear my heart rate strap every ride. I encourage my athletes to, because I need to understand how their body is responding. And so heart rate is a response to the training that they do, right? It is a way to respond to that training. And that's a critical factor. But at the same time, that was like, well, that's response training. Well, what happens? My heart rate went up to 180. Why did it do that? Well, we didn't know. Did you just sprint up a hill? Did you, finish a 20-minute climb at your maximum? Did you have 6 cups of coffee and you're sitting on the start line ready to race?
Right.
It didn't measure the training dose. And so that's the next piece that really makes a huge difference and has created that change is that, now we understand the training dose. Here's the dose. Okay, I rode for 20 minutes at my threshold power, and here's the response. My heart rate went to 180. I incurred this amount of fatigue. I burned this many kilojoules of energy. I created this training load.
Right.
All of these things were are a key piece in how we changed, our training.
Right. Yeah, so the power meter, as you in the book, you guys described this, how power is a direct measure of your effort, whereas heart rate might be a lagging indicator of what's going on, which I think is a good way for people to understand it. I remember some of my earliest memories was going down to the Museum of Science in Boston, and they had a bike set up, and the kids would go down there, and then they had several light bulbs, and you needed to get on the bike and pedal as hard as you can, and it was a little game to see how many light bulbs you could light up. And that's one of the things that when we use the word watt in the purest scientific sense, you could, if you put out 40 watts on a bike, you could literally light a 40-watt light bulb. Right. Exactly. And so that just it draws it all together, that watt in the purest sense of the word is watts as we know it in the real world.
Right. It's a measure of work. Right. It's a measure of work, and that's where it's interesting, right? Because there is an amount of energy, right, and that's the relationship that is required to light a light bulb, and there is an amount of energy that is required to do work. And so that's exactly the connection. Right? It's like, I'm going to get on that bike and I'm going to pedal hard and I'm going to pedal fast, and I'm having to use my energy to do that, which then is being converted into the energy needed to light a light bulb. Yep.
It's very interesting. It's fascinating. And let's talk about, so let's go into some of the metrics. Okay. So let's talk about, we can do them in any order that you think is most appropriate. But first, the concept of FTP and training stress score, whichever order that you think that they flow better.
Right. Well, let's talk about FTP first. I mean, FTP stands for functional threshold power. And, there's been, this is something that, we go back to 2005, 2004, where, Andy came up with the training zones, the classic power training zones. He built all of those training zones around that FTP, that functional threshold power. He called it functional threshold power because we're measuring power. It is a threshold at which you can ride, and when you go above that threshold, fatigue occurs sooner, and when you stay below it, fatigue occurs later. It is functional because you're actually doing it on a bicycle. You're out there doing it in a real world environment. You're not just stuck on some random machine on in a lab somewhere, and it's actually here. You can use this. It's something that you can use on your bike every single day. So, the definition is the highest power you can maintain in a quasi-steady state without fatiguing. When you exceed it, you fatigue sooner. When you go underneath it, you fatigue in a longer period of time. Quasi-steady state means that, sometimes you go above it, sometimes you go below it. You're kind of hovering around this edge. And so that's an important thing. It was built around the fact that, in cycling in the U.S., that a very typical test for us as cyclists is a 40-kilometer time trial. It's also, that's the Olympic distance in triathlon bike leg. And if you ride as hard as you can in a 40-kilometer time trial, one of the goals as a cyclist is to do that in under an hour. So that really was the bar. It says, okay, well, your functional threshold power, your FTP, is the average power that you can maintain for an hour.
Right.
And based on that, and so that's the answer, right? It still is, and that's where that is now. Over time, and one of the things that we proposed and have created in our first edition in 2006 was that, well, gosh, it's really hard to find a place to do an hour-long time trial for many of us, and without stoplights and traffic and all these crazy things. But we could more easily find an area where we could go for 20 minutes. So. And again, 20 minutes is a little bit easier mentally, than doing a full hour. So we said, hey, you can do a 20-minute test, subtract about 5% of that, and that should be a close approximation of what your hour power would be. Now, one of the things that's gotten forgotten, in history, which is kind of crazy to me to think that this is gotten forgotten, but at the same time it is. Over time, stuff gets kind of cut out, is that in order to really make that more accurate, and you need to blow out what we call your anaerobic work capacity. So before you do the 20-minute test, if you're going to shorten your test to 20 minutes, you need to do the 5-minute test first. So you're going to warm up, maybe do some fast pedaling drills, then you crush it for 5 minutes, right? You kill it for 5 minutes. You do your very best 5 minutes, which is generally a measure of what we call your Vo2 Max. Mm-hmm. It contains a lot of anaerobic ability. For those who have a strong anaerobic capacity, it could be up to 2 minutes of that would be a part of that test. For those without, maybe it's only 30 seconds. But the purpose of that 5-minute effort is to rid yourself of the anaerobic work capacity, get rid of your freshness, give you a little bit of fatigue so that now you take a 5-minute break, and then, bam, you whack out that 20 minutes. You start the 20-minute without that anaerobic work capacity. You feel a little fatigued already. Then you still take the 5% off of the 20-minute number, and that makes it even more accurate to the hour test. So that 5-minute thing is just really critical. So I want everybody who's listening to remember that, if you want to do a 20-minute test, if you're going to shorten it from 60 minutes, you got to do the 5-minute first. So
that's very interesting, because I got to admit, I had completely forgot about that over time, that 5-minute. And so I would either do or have an athlete do a decent warm-up. But you're saying that the 5-minute all-out effort is critical in getting a pure FTP result.
Yes. Well, and let's not say pure. Let's say a more accurate.
More accurate, FTP, right.
More accurate FTP result. Taking that 5% off is a guess, right? It's mm-hmm. a guess. For those people who have really great anaerobic work capacities, that may need to take 8. For those people who are just pure aerobic animals, they're just pure steady state time trialists, climbers, endurance athletes, they may only need to take 2% off, mm-hmm. And so they're, oh wow, my FTP can just be right here. Now, let's talk about another concept that we've come up with in the third edition called time to exhaustion, mm-hmm. TTE. And there's been some confusion about time to exhaustion. People have said, well, what is time to exhaustion? And so this is a concept that that the WKO software, Trainingpeaks WKO. So kind of back up here just a second, but our Cycling Peaks software that we created in 2003, we merged Cycling Peaks with a company called Training Bible. Joe Friel, Dirk Friel, another guy named Gear Fisher started trainingbible.com. Yep. We had a company called Cycling Peaks. Training Bible, Cycling Peaks became Training Peaks. So that was we had the desktop software, they had the online software, etc. So then our software that desktop software became what's called WKO, which stands for workout. So that's now in its 5th version that just came out this July. And the 4th version we came out with it, we had this concept called time to exhaustion. And so the software automatically gave you your time to exhaustion. And some people mistakenly thought, oh, well, that's my FTP. But if you think about it, so let's say, for example, I'm going to go out and do an hour test. And my hour-long test, in that test, I'm going to hold, let's say I end up averaging, let's just use easy numbers, 300 watts. I end up averaging 300 watts. In the hour test, for 48 minutes, I hold 320 watts. But in the last 12 minutes, I kind of fall apart and only hold 260 watts in the last 12 minutes. So my average ends up being 300 watts. Okay, so then your time to exhaustion is 48 minutes. Mm-hmm. But your FTP is still 300 watts. It's not 320, and it's not 260, but it's 300 watts. That's what you average for the hour. So it's an important concept for a lot of people who've sent me emails and asked me questions online and stuff and in person. Like, I don't understand the difference between these two things. They seem like the same thing, but they're not. So think of time to exhaustion as, wow, if you can hold that number all the way for 60 minutes, let's say you held 320 watts for 60 minutes, and then you kind of fall off the cart, right? Then your time to exhaustion would equal your FTP. It would be 320.
Yeah.
And it's a leading indicator too. So for me, when I see the time to exhaustion start pushing from 48 to 52 to 56 to 58 to an hour, then it's like, oh, guess what? Their FTP is about to improve. It's kind of this leading indicator for us to use as well. So anyway, hopefully that clears up some misconceptions there.
That's good. Okay. And so you get the FTP your number, and so how often do you test for changes in the FTP?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because we as humans, our physiology generally improves every 6 to 8 weeks.
Right.
So give an athlete training stress for 6 to 8 weeks, and then they have an adaptation and they get stronger, supercompensation. So that's what we need to test, because we need to, every 6 to 8 weeks, if we're in a build cycle or even a foundational cycle of training where we're trying to improve our fitness, then we need to see, like, well, where are we now? Because then we'll reset our training zones. If our FTP goes from 200 watts to 220 watts, well, you need to train differently.
Right. Or if you're not seeing any improvement at all, that must mean something hasn't really gone right in the last 6 weeks that you need to revisit.
Exactly. And we need to know when we're losing fitness too, right? Because it's like, oh, wow, right now here we are, kind of the beginning of what I would term the winter training time period. And it's like, okay, time to get ready for the winter off season and training seriously about what I'm going to do in the following year. So I need to know what my baseline is. Yeah. Where's my FTP right now before I even start my serious winter training? And so that's an important thing to test every 6 to 8 weeks.
All right. And so now let's talk about the PMC. So you know your FTP, got your FTP, you're testing every 6 weeks, and then you have the performance management chart where you can look at something called fitness, fatigue, and form. Explain that for our listeners.
All right, absolutely. So the performance manager chart, the PMC chart, that comes from this idea that I had back in 2004 or so, 2003, thinking about this stuff, and how do we periodize a person's training plan purely from their training load and having a training stress score. So you have to have the training stress score. And then we think about, well, what is form? Right? There's this idea of form that we've heard on TV and the internet of like, oh, he's got great form, or this athlete's on form and he's feeling, he's riding really strong, he's on form. And for forever, it was like this, you'd hear the commentators talk about this, and then you'd see some amazing pro cyclist every single year in April, they would be killing people in the classics. And she's like, how in the world does this person peak in April every single year and always have good form in April? What did they do? And nobody really was able to figure that out because we didn't have the tools to say that. And then we had the magic wand, right? It was like, oh, well, somebody just put a magic wand over them and said, boom, you have form, right? Well, in reality, right, what is form? Well, form, you have to have two things. First, you have to be fit, right? So I can't sit on the couch for 3 months in the winter and expect to win Paris-Roubaix in April. Not going to happen, right? You also have to have what we call freshness. So freshness at the end of a Tour de France, let's say you go do the Tour de France, 3 weeks long, you may be really fit from doing the Tour de France, but you're really fatigued.
Right.
And so you're not fresh. So you don't have form either. So form is fitness plus freshness, and creating that balance. How can I be as fit as I can be? And then also I need the freshness that I need that I can have without losing fitness, right? Because you gain freshness by resting. You rest too much, now you're losing fitness. You gain fitness by training, but if you train too much and too hard, you lose freshness. So we're constantly trying to balance that. And fitness, right? Freshness is the easy side of the equation. You just rest. Boom, no problem. Fitness, that comes from two concepts that we have to think of. That's one, training stress, right? Fitness comes from training stress. You got to go hard. But it comes from what we call chronic training load. So CTL, chronic training load. And that's where we look at the last 42 days of your training and we say, here's the last 6 weeks of your training. What you did in the last 6 weeks impacts you right now. So that's what helps us to understand where your current fitness is, your FTP. Then we also, and of course, everything you did last 6 months, last year, the last 5 years also impacts your FTP. But really, like, we look at those last 6 weeks as the key piece to that. And then we also have acute training load, ATL. That's the fatigue you feel in your muscles right now, Tony. Like, you had a big weekend of training, you went out and rode 4 or 5 hours, you did intervals, you're sore still, then that's that soreness that you feel in the legs right now. So it can be from the last 7 days all the way out to around 14 days or so, that acute training load. So we need to understand, well, okay, we've got both the acute training load, the stuff we just did last week, the chronic training load, the stuff that we've done over the last 6 weeks. What's that total training load? And then that helps us to balance, well, maybe you need to have a rest week, or maybe you just need to rest 3 days, and then come back from that. And that rest is what we call, or the form piece of it is what we call training stress balance. Yeah. So again, back to the balancing act. I want to balance my highest fitness. I want to balance the right amount of freshness. I don't want to be too fresh. I don't want to be too fatigued. I want to have the right balance so that I create that peak of fitness on May 15th.
Yeah. Now, just to answer a little bit of question here, I was always curious on how did you and Dr. Coggin come up with the 42 days? So CTL 42 days, maybe, why not 50 days or 55 days? So I'm sure that there was probably some tests done to come up with the 42 days for CTL, 7 days for ATL. Can you explain?
Yeah, so that comes from some literature, some science studies. So there's been a lot of studies that have been done in this kind of modeling. Over 30 studies that have been done in English language papers. They've covered everything from weightlifting to running to hammer throwing to, all kinds of crazy sports that have been studied. And in general, all of them have looked at that 6-week cycle. And again, kind of back to the 6 to 8 weeks, we all essentially improve in those 6 to 8 week cycles. And so Andy went back to the literature, said, hey, you know what? This is the most common time period that was studied and saw adaptations in that time period. So that makes the most sense. We really need to look at this from a 6-week or 42-day standard.
Got it. So this is really the genius of this work in that so every workout that you do has a training stress score from 1 to 100, although it could be over 100, and then the fitness is measured by looking at the last 42 days of training stress scores.
Yes,
and then the fatigue is viewed as the last seven days of training stress, and then you take the difference to get the training stress balance or how fresh you are to race.
Correct. Exactly.
And with this, you can do a lot with this. You can try to execute the perfect taper. Sometimes people are trying to do their triathlon taper, and this works with running too. So marathon, you're trying to figure out the best way to taper. And if you have this data and if you have access to your PMC, you can try to see, come up with the best taper to try to hit race day on the day that you feel really fresh and ready to go. So
right, because and so then that kind of leads us to the next concept and another common question that we have is, and it's we've got some pretty cool charts in the 3rd edition of Training and Racing with a Power Meter book, but that talk about this. But the next question was, well, how fresh do I need to be? What should my training stress balance should be to have a peak, right? Should it be +5? Should it be -5? Should it be +30, -30? I mean, these kind of numbers, the difference again between chronic training load and acute training load, what should it be on the day? And so we queried 300 athletes who were using our using our beta test of this and asked them, hey, when you created a best, like a personal best, for any time range, 1 minute, 5 minutes, 27 minutes, 12 seconds or whatever, and you had a best power, right? Oh man, I cracked out 684 watts for 1 minute and that was my best ever. Whatever that is, we asked them, well, what was your training stress balance when you had one of those bests? And so we got lots of information. Some people were very fatigued. They were -30. Some people were highly rested. They were +30. But generally, most people were between, let's say, -10, so a little fatigued, and a +15, pretty fresh. And at 0, you'd be in balance, right? You'd not be fresh, you wouldn't be fatigued, you'd be in balance. And so then we separated out that data and we said, well, what happens if we look at the data from a perspective of seeing just the bests that are less than 5 minutes? So people who scored a personal best for wattage at 3 minutes and 27 seconds, at 4 minutes and 52 seconds, at 7 seconds, whatever, anything less than 5 minutes. When we did that, that shifted the data to the right, meaning that it made all of those people who scored a personal best at less than 5 minute time frame, they have more freshness. They needed more freshness. and they had more freshness. They had rested more for those short time frames, and that made sense because when you less than 5 minutes is a lot of anaerobic work capacity, just like we talked about earlier with the whole testing of FTP. It's really important. But that comes when your anaerobic work capacity is at its greatest. That's when you're most rested, right? So I can sit on the couch for a month and not ride my bicycle at all, probably go out and do a 1 minute test, and it'll be my best for the year because it's largely anaerobic.
Yeah.
Don't need a lot of fitness for that. So anyway, so that's an important concept because if you're doing a really short, hard effort, then you need more freshness. Now, contrast that with, okay, I'm, I haven't ridden my bike in 3 months, and there's a Gran Fondo 100-mile ride that I want to do in 2 weeks, but I haven't ridden in 3 months. Should I just sit on the couch for another 2 weeks and be really fresh going into that 100-mile ride? Right? We know the answer, right? That's no, right? No, of course not. Like,
exactly.
You're going to be out of shape. So what do, right? For 2 weeks, right? You go and you train and you do your best, and it's going to suck, and you're going to try and get your miles up and get a little bit of cramming in terms of fitness and training. And then 3 days before, or maybe even 2 days before that Gran Fondo, that 100-mile event or whatever it is, you then rest. But in 2 days, you're still going to be tired from that 12 days of hard training because you hadn't ridden in 3 months. You're still going to be tired, but you can go into that event now with more fatigue because it's more aerobic,
right?
And you'll do better than you would have done had you just sat on the couch for 2 weeks.
Yeah,
so,
it's a very interesting concept, and I'm definitely going to have to get the third edition now because I want to know the latest thinking on this. But it's very common as a coach athlete, and then as a coach, we often, mainly we're working with a lot of long course athletes, marathoners, as well as Ironman, half Ironman athletes. And this is one of the biggest challenges. We're looking at the PMC with 3 weeks out, 2 weeks out, and then you're seeing TSB numbers that are either slightly negative or slightly positive. And then you're thinking, how do you play the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? And this is the biggest challenge because a lot of athletes have a different idea about taper. They think that you just do absolutely nothing, and it's possible that you can over taper. Right. And then there's you have people that are still doing fairly hard workouts 2 weeks from a half Ironman, and they're still looking at negative TSB numbers. And so this is the thing that is the challenge that I want to get more information about on how to play out the targeting of the training stress balance that's going to get the athlete to the best possible performance, whether it be half Ironman, marathon, or whatever. Right.
Well, and when you think about triathlon, is obviously 3 sports, right? So you got to deal with the 3 sports, and running adds such a monkey wrench into everything because of the structural stress that is created. You're pounding everything on the ground, all the joints, the tendons, ligaments, everything is getting pounded. So you're creating a different kind of stress than you do when you're just riding a bicycle in concentric contractions, and there's none of this kind of gravity that's impacting you. So I think, to me, this is one of the beauties of having a power meter on the bicycle, and now we've got power meters for running as well. So that's really great. We've got the Stride running Stride device and the Run Scribe as well. Those are really amazing tools because we can quantify the training load. But, in running, we need to taper longer because we need to rid ourselves of that structural stress. And so in the past, and I think now currently for folks who don't have power meters and don't really understand this concept, they taper the bike and the run at the same time, a month out from their Ironman. And it's like, well, shoot, in a month, you're losing a lot of aerobic fitness.
Right, yeah.
Where you could, from what I coach and the way that I work with and all of our coaches work with athletes is like, well, taper the run a month out like normal because we got to get rid of that structural load. We got to make sure we're ready. But keep the bike going because we can keep the bike going for another 2 weeks, taper 10 to 12 days out for the Ironman, and we've got an additional 14 days or more, depending on how you respond to training and recover, of aerobic training that you would have lost that fitness, and it's like, wow, I had a chance to actually improve my fitness for 2 more weeks before that Ironman because I was doing it on a bicycle and now managing that taper so that both the run and the bike taper correctly into the Ironman.
Yeah. Now, if there's ever a value proposition for a coach, this is it, because this is where, you're looking at someone, you really need now be somewhat of a data scientist to really look at some of this and interpret it. And maybe the TSB for a marathon is different for the TSB that you're looking to target for an Ironman. And it's a lot involved here. And, but I think, again, you guys have really laid out the science here so that, over time, is the person that's not very familiar with how to read some of this can understand it in very intuitive ways with graphs, charts. Someone can look at a number and get an idea of where they need to be. So I definitely am going to have to get the 3rd edition.
Great, excellent.
So yeah, so I mean, TSS, CTL, ATL, all of it has very practical application. So, someone has, let's say they have, an Ironman coming up, and they want to use something like IF. You mentioned IF, intensity factor. They want to use that to, target the right effort to run off the bike well.
Yes.
For our listeners, how can you enlighten them there on how to use these metrics, and particularly IF?
Right. So IF, and we'll just kind of reiterate what IF is. It's the intensity factor, and that's the measurement of the intensity as a relationship to your threshold power. So when you're riding right at your threshold power, let's say, for example, your FTP is 250 watts, and you're riding right at 250 watts, your intensity factor is 1.0. When your intensity factor is 0.8, that means that you're right around 80% of your FTP. When your intensity factor is 1.2, it's 120% of your FTP. So what we found is, and looking through thousands of power meter files and from triathletes from all distances, all the way from sprint to double Ironman, the best ride at a certain intensity level in order to have a good run. And so that's basically what we based all of our recommendations on. It's like, okay, if you want to do this well, here's what the best age groupers do and still have a good run. Here's what the best pros do and still have a good run. So then we started to kind of quantify based on that evidence that, if you're going to do a solid run, then you've got to be within this range. So we have a chart there in the third edition that describes what those numbers are. But let's say, for example, you're a new, relatively new triathlete. You're going for your first ever Ironman, and you just want to finish the thing and not collapse at the finish line and crawl to the finish line, and be able to still run. Right? You want to be able to run. Maybe you got to walk a little bit, but mainly still run. Then you're going to need to ride between around 67, 68, 66, 69, 66 to 69% of your FTP. Mm-hmm. So your intensity factor is going to be in that range, 0.66 to 0.69. It's going to be relatively low. You're going to be essentially just in what we call, the middle range of endurance zone, right? It's the endurance zone. Endurance is between 56 and 75% of your FTP. So you're going to be right in the middle of your endurance training zone. And then that, as long as you fuel yourself correctly, as long as you pedal correctly, because there's a whole other discussion about how you create watts. Do you pedal, too slowly with more force, or do you pedal too quickly with less force? So that's a whole nother discussion. So you got to pedal correctly, then you'll be good for the run. Now, contrast that with some of the best professionals in the world. The best professional triathletes for an Ironman, they don't ride much harder. They may only do 78% of their FTP for the Ironman bike leg and still run. Mm-hmm. I've seen some professionals ride at 74% of their FTP and still run amazingly well and win the overall Ironman as well. So it is one of those things that is critical to pace yourself correctly in, and where a power meter makes a huge difference on race day.
Right, and so if you know that number from the book, and IF is your normalized power during the bike leg divided by your FTP, so that you know that is probably going to be less than 1, then you know what that number is. You put it on your head unit or your watch and display, and you try to target that number throughout the entire bike leg with your effort. And
yes,
if you know that that's the number that you need to hit in order to get the right IF, you just sort of watch that power like a hawk throughout the entire bike leg to know that if I do that, and I should be able to. And of course, you're trying to practice this, right? You practice this to try to get it right. So
right. No, it takes. I mean, just like anything else, Tony, it takes practice. Mm-hmm. But it comes from awareness of how do I feel, what does my number say, all of those things, and kind of back to our beginning of our conversation here was the difference between subjective, like, oh, I feel like this, and then objective, what do the numbers say? Because a lot of times, you come out of the water, you're all psyched, right? You're in full transition mode, and you jump on the bike, and you're like, oh man, I feel great, I'm gonna crush this bike, right? And your goal is 240 watts, and you look down at your power meter and you're doing 290 watts.
Right.
You're like, oh, I can handle this, right? No, you can't.
Right, exactly.
You need to be like, okay, I need to hold 240 watts. I better back it off, no matter how good you feel, because your perceived exertion is incongruent with your actual exertion. They don't line up.
Yeah.
And so that's where a power meter keeps you honest.
Yeah, the closer that IF gets to 1, you better be ready for a hard day on that run.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so this is the thing that we have to, we need to drive home this as coaches, the importance of, getting a power meter. And so how do you do this with some of your athletes? So someone's looking to spend some money on something, and you're trying to figure out what's a high return on investment purchase, and the price of power meters have dropped. I've seen them drop over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and now they got pedal based versions. So somebody's looking to say, look, I got some money, I want to spend it on. Should I spend it on the power meter, or should I spend it on all of these pricey wheels, pricey rear disc, lighter aero bars, things like that? How do you talk to your athletes to get them to make high return on investment decisions?
Right. Well, I am a little biased.
That's cool.
So, my answer is always going to be a power meter.
Right.
But I think that's. It's a super important question, because you have to say, okay, what is truly going to make a difference here for me, okay, we have to and think about it from that kind of cost benefit analysis and say, okay, wow, fancy wheels are really great. I love going into the bike shop and looking at all the fancy wheels and being like, oh my gosh, lusting over that pair. I want that pair right there. That's going to make me faster. And so that's always a great thing, to feel faster and to be faster. So I think wheels are absolutely important. But if you have a choice between a power meter and new fancy wheels, you got to go with a power meter, because the new fancy wheels over a 112-mile Ironman or over a 100-mile Gran Fondo event or whatever that is, especially in a time trial like in an Ironman where it's just you against the clock and you're there. I mean, that can make the difference of 2 minutes, 3 minutes, maybe in a crazy windy one where you got some benefit from a crosswind and it was pushing you along, 5 minutes. Okay. So that seems like a lot, and it is a lot. I'm not discounting the benefit of wheels, and they are definitely important. But if you don't understand your pacing and you don't use a power meter in training, and you learn what your FTP is, and you quantify your training load, and you don't understand how to taper yourself so that you truly are rested as much as you need to be or as little as you need to be, and then use that power meter in the event itself, I mean, that could be an hour. Right?
Yeah.
The difference could be an hour. It could be the difference between running in the run or walking in the run. It could be the difference between not finishing the run at all and dropping out because you've got cramps because you pushed too hard in the bike and you used all your muscle glycogen, and you got nothing left for the run.
Yeah.
So
100%, I think. You face the human psychology, the wheels and the rear disc and all of the pretty stuff that you can buy for the bike. They appeal to the athlete's desire to look good, take some awesome race photos, but it's harder. It's harder for them to see the long-term benefit of not only having the power meter, but working with someone who really knows how to extract all of the benefits from it.
Right, exactly.
And the prices are coming down. The most expensive part, I think you have, maybe it's in your book, the most expensive part of the power meter is this thing called the strain gauge. And then, but the prices I've seen are coming down significantly now. Are you seeing the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this has definitely been the benefit of, competition here in our amazing capitalist country where, we got more competition that lowers prices. I love economics. And, and so to me now it's not even an excuse, right? Price used to be a really big excuse, like, oh man, I just can't afford a power meter. But now it's like, you know what? Come on. I mean, $300 you can buy a power meter.
Right.
And for years and years, I've always said, like, man, the first company that makes a $300 power meter is just going to crush it and make this, incredibly ubiquitous among every bike. And we're seeing bikes that come with power meters now, which is so cool, because like you just buy the bike and it's part of the bike.
Yep.
It's spec'd on your bike. And so I think that's a great thing. And you can buy all kinds of these things on, used on eBay or Craigslist too, all the time. They're always on there, where people who are moving out of the sport or have bought another power meter are buying them. I mean, most, I think, serious triathletes and serious cyclists, we've got multiple bikes, of course, N+1. You got multiple power meters. Got a power meter on every bike, which is great, because if you're training on a road bike or training on a triathlon bike or racing mountain bikes or racing cyclocross or doing gravel events, you want to quantify that data. You want to know, like, what was that gravel race like? How many TSS did I get? How much power did I put out? How does that relate to, my training? And so that's a good thing.
Yeah. One question I wanted to ask you too is, where do you stand, or how do you address this question with your athletes on this great cadence debate, right? So how do you generate power with an athlete? So should you go for force and torque and just pushing harder gears, or do you get them to pedal faster, and how can a power meter help them figure that question out?
No, that's a great question. That's such a great question. So let's define wattage, right? So wattage is a multiplication. It's coming from two things. It's how hard you pedal on one side, right, multiplied by how fast you're pedaling. So if I pedal harder in a big gear, let's say, for example, you put it in the big chain ring and you put it in the smallest cog in the back, and you push really hard, but you do it slowly, 50 RPM, you can still produce 1,000 watts, right? So you can produce a lot of power. Or I can do the opposite. I can pedal really quickly at 120 RPM and not put out a lot of force, not push hard on the pedals, right? So I could do it in my small chain ring, and in the biggest cog on the back, let's say that's a 28, and I can pedal crazy fast and still produce 1,000 watts. It's the same watts, right? It's the same amount of work, but now you're creating those watts differently. And so the creation of the watts is really critical. Now, a lot of times, the creation of the watts is it's not predetermined, but it is influenced, let's say, for example, by your percentage of muscle fiber type. The athlete that has a little more fast twitch muscle fiber, they actually want to use that muscle, right? They have big muscles, they're a little stronger, they tend to pedal a little slower and use more force. The athletes who have more slow twitch muscle fibers, they have less mass on their legs. They want to pedal a little faster and shift that load to their heart, right? Shift that load to their cardiovascular system. So that's a component of it. So when we always consider how should I produce watts, well, we gotta kind of have to look at the athlete a little bit and figure that out. We all get to a place where we're producing what I call the self-selected cadence. That's the cadence that you get to where you feel good at pedaling. Like I feel good pedaling at this RPM. And that takes time. That takes 3 to 5 years of consistently riding and training to get to a place where, for me, I'm 88 RPM. Boom. Put me at 88 RPM, I can pedal there all day. I'm happy as a clam. Put me at 95, I'm going to be like, oh, it's a little too fast, right? Put me at 83 RPM, I'm kind of mashing now and using probably too much glycogen in my legs to maintain a good endurance, over time.
Mm-hmm.
So when we consider those factors and we think about triathlon, most triathletes pedal with too much force and too slowly. They're pedaling at 80 RPM or 85 RPM, but pushing too hard on the pedals,
Mm-hmm.
which uses too much force, too much strength from the muscles. And then they're using more glycogen, so they don't have it for the run. They're not preserving that glycogen for the run. And so that's a critical thing. So I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that triathletes make, is that they pedal too slowly with too much force. So I encourage them, hey, let's get to 90 RPM.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get to 95 RPM and pedal at 90 to 95 RPM. Now we're taking some of the load off the muscles. We're shifting more of that load to the cardiovascular system, to the heart, right? And that is a more, let's say, it's not robust, or it just has, you got more endurance in your cardiovascular system than you do in your muscles, and we can preserve that
Mm-hmm.
for the run. So that's a big thing. Andy Coggan came up with a tool called quadrant analysis. And that is a scatter plot. Looks like a shotgun blast
Mm-hmm.
of points on an XY axis, and that tells us where you spend your time creating watts. Do you spend it pedaling too hard and too slow? Do you spend it pedaling too fast? Because that's the opposite side, right? Oh, I can pedal at 110 RPM, but no wattage, or very little wattage, or very little force. Sorry, that also may be too much.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely, the quadrant analysis tool is a really great tool, and again, kind of in the third edition, there's a chapter on triathlon. I go through some examples of quadrant analysis. Here's the way that you should pedal. Your quadrant analysis graph should look if you manage this correctly. And here's a bad example. What happens when you don't do it correctly, and you're at danger of not finishing the run or walking on your run.
Right.
So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, this is very important. And I'm just thinking about, so a lot of people, when they talk about this, and you see people on social media talk about it, and they oversimplify it. You should do this, you should do that. And this shows you that it's more complicated, right? You're looking at not only how someone is generating power, but the body composition of the athlete may come into play. So I was always just like you describe. I think I was the person that was always trying to push harder gears and pedaling slowly. And that was a big part of the problem. And I always thought that was the right thing to do, just because I'm sort of a mesomorph, what they call a mesomorph, which is someone who retains a lot of muscle. Like the lower half of my body looks like a running back.
Right.
And so I would try to push really hard gears, and then I would always ride 55, 42 up front. But yeah, this is harder. This is harder to come to a conclusion than most people think, and so this is just another reason why this book and someone who can help figure it all out is important. So
absolutely no, it's a critical thing. I see it all the time in triathlon, and I mean, when we speak about cycling, we'll just let me give you a real quick example. I mean, mountain biking, we also use quadrant analysis to make sure that our races and our training is correct. Right. Mm-hmm. In mountain biking, I'm going to average 300 watts in a mountain bike race with my normalized power, the power I would do if I pedal smoothly. But do I produce, and I can go out and do that same watts in training, right? I'm going to come on a road bike, and I'm going to go ride on the road bike and do 300 watt intervals, or maybe even harder, right, or whatever. but am I producing the watts the way that I do on my mountain bike? And I was been very fortunate to coach some incredible athletes over the years. And one of my favorite athletes to coach is Jeremiah Bishop, who's been a long-time pro, still is a pro, 40 years old plus now in mountain biking. And the first thing that I did when I started working with Jeremiah is we got an SRM for him, put it on his mountain bike, went out and captured some data. We need to figure out the demands of mountain biking. Well, because we didn't have any data on mountain bike. We didn't know what the athletes did. So I started capturing all this data on all of his races and looking at his training data from his road bike, and this pattern emerged. Like, wow, every single mountain bike race he did, he would spend 40 to 60% of the time in quadrant 3 of the quadrant analysis, and that's the high force, lower cadence, below 90 RPM, but pushing hard. And I was like, wow, isn't this interesting? He's doing this. This is the key characteristic of all these different kinds of mountain bike races: climbing, single track, rocky, rooty, fast, flowy ones. This is a key characteristic of mountain biking and the demand of the sport. And then I looked at his road training, because he was predominantly training on the road at the time because of the consistency you can get from training on the road. And he was in quadrant 4, which is pedaling quickly over 90 RPM, but not with a lot of force. So here his races are a lot of force in quadrant 2 and not much cadence under 90 RPM, but then he's training at a high cadence over 90 RPM but low force. And I was like, oh crap, we got to change your training. You're training the watts, but you're not creating them correctly. And so we completely changed the way that he trained from a creation of the watts perspective. So we use that same tool, that same quadrant analysis tool, to match, are my training and my races, congruent? Are we creating the watts the same way? That's another great thing that's important when we think about how to train.
Right. Excellent. All right. We'll finish up with a couple more questions. You had mentioned very quickly about running with power. Is it your opinion that this is going to get even more critically important as and impactful as cycling with power?
I think running with power it has the potential. It absolutely has the potential to do it. I really sincerely hope so, that it will be just as impactful as a power meter on the bicycle. I haven't seen that yet, though, and so that's kind of a bummer, because it's kind of like, well, gosh, why hasn't this been adopted in training? Why aren't the best runners in the world using these tools in their races, in their training? I'm definitely out of the running loop. That's not my expertise. So maybe some of these guys and ladies are using them, and we just don't see them in races yet. I hope that changes, because I think there can be some big changes that they can make. Because number one, quantifying your training load alone is worth the price of admission. Just knowing what your running training stress score is. So Dr. Stephen McGregor, who's a coach here at Peaks Coaching Group, he created running training stress score. So there's a TSS for that, which is important. So you can plot it in your performance manager chart. Then the other piece of it is just, how do we balance this difference between pace? Okay, I'm going to run an 8-minute mile, or I'm going to run a 7-minute and 30-second mile, and power output. Because I can run a 7-minute and 30-second mile and produce 350 watts of power, and the cost for that, my response to my heart rate goes to 180. Or, I can run a 7-minute and 40-second mile, land a little lighter on the ground, not be quite so stressed, and produce 250 watts of power,
Mm-hmm.
and heart rate only goes to 170, right? So all of a sudden my response is a lot less. It's not costing me metabolically quite as much, and therefore there's this balance. So power and running, and that's the hard part to wrap your head around if you come from the cycling world. It's like, well, 300 watts may not be better than 250 watts in running. We know it's definitely better in cycling.
Yeah.
It's maybe not better in running if that means that you're landing harder, your contact time on the ground is longer. All these things are a piece of the puzzle. So I think, Tony, some of the issue with the adoption is the complication factor, right? It's just it's just a little more complicated than just, this number is better because it's a bigger number.
Yeah, and I think, but you'd agree that, like the example that we gave in the beginning, if I were to put out 40 watts on the bike, that would light a 40-watt light bulb. You wouldn't be able to say the same thing with running power, because there's some other things I think built into that watts number, like biomechanical movements, and so maybe it will, but I'm not sure. What's your?
Yeah,
it's not watts in the purest scientific sense of
right.
watts, right?
Because it's still looking at force times velocity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're looking at cadence, right, which is
cadence,
how fast your leg turnover is, and then there's force, how hard you're hitting the ground with, right? So that's the piece that's like, well, if you hit the ground really hard, then that may not be the best thing if you're trying to optimize your run for an Ironman, or for a marathon, or for a half marathon, or even a 10K. So that's the difference. Now, if you're a runner that's doing the 100-meter dash, or the 400, or the 800, or the track, you're a sprinter, then we know for sure those people will hit the ground harder, right? That's a key characteristic of them. Is like, man, they just nail the ground and they launch themselves off of that ground. So that's a key part for sprinters. Yeah,
interesting. And of course, there's like you mentioned, there's Stride, there's RunScribe. Garmin even has gotten into the game and has made it part of their Garmin Connect. Okay. WKO5 just came out, and so I've had the WKO4 for many years. Are there any new aspects of the WKO5 release that are new and different?
Yeah, so WKO5 came out, and that was a launch here in July, and it's been WKO4 has been wildly successful, and WKO5 is created there's a few new metrics, which has been kind of fun, training impact score. So there's a new impact score. There's been a change in some user interface there. We've got a little different calendar in there now. There's a thing called smart segments. So kind of playing off of the Strava segment piece, where if I go and ride this climb every day, or let's say once a week, you can make that climb start and finish a segment, and then you can compare all those segments that you've done over the last 10 years, 20 years in my case, of doing that climb with the power meter. So those are fun. And then there's also one that another new concept that came out that's in our book called functional reserve capacity, and that's the power that you can maintain, or the work that you can do. It's really not the power you can maintain. It's really the work that you can do above your FTP. So when we think about FTP, we have 3 training zones essentially above it: Vo2 Max, anaerobic capacity, and neuromuscular power. FRC is kind of an umbrella that covers those. And it's the functional reserve capacity, the work you can do above your FTP. And that is like a battery, right? And so you can decharge that battery as you ride if you do really hard, intense efforts. So let's say, for example, I mean, and I love this analogy of thinking about it because I'm a huge Formula One fan, and in Formula One cars now they have two engines. They have the hybrid engine, the electric engine, and they have their normal gasoline-powered engine. The gasoline-powered engine, when you've got the foot on the throttle all the way fully open, that's your FTP. You're at FTP. And then they have a button on their steering wheel. They can push a button on their steering wheel, and that gives them a 100 horsepower boost from the electric engine. Now they can hold that button down for 10 seconds and get that whole 100 horsepower for 10 seconds, but then the battery's drained. Like there's nothing left. They've got to now recover that energy, and they do that through braking. They recharge the battery. Or they can hold it down for half of the amount, and they can do it for 20 seconds. They can get 50 horsepower for 20 seconds. So that may be enough to do what they need to do, but then they've got to recover that energy. So imagine that same button on your bicycle, right? Wow, I can push that button on my handlebars, and I can take off up this hill and just go as hard as I can for 10 seconds and use all of my functional reserve capacity. And if I do that and go as hard as I possibly can for 10 seconds, then that battery's totally drained. And if I go only half that way for 20 seconds, then it's halfway drained. And I've got to be underneath my FTP to recover it. We don't have that braking thing, but I can be underneath my FTP to recover it. So there is a new chart in there called Dynamic FRC, which you can look at and you can see just how your battery drains. Oh, wow, look, I almost got dropped and my battery was completely almost drained. And then, boom, I recovered because the pace eased up. So that's a fun little chart that we've been having fun with and looking at. So absolutely, there's some really fun stuff in the new WKO 5.
Yeah, and I like the new graphical interface. It's amazing. And
well, good. And just to be clear, Tony, too, I'm very good friends with those guys. I sold my equity at the end of 2014, so I'm no longer an owner of Trainingpeaks anymore. I still own Peaks Coaching Group fully, but Trainingpeaks is owned by some of the founders of it. But and these guys are all still great friends of mine. So I don't have any commercial interest there, but obviously use it every day and love it. So I have a great time with it. Got
it. All right. Now, how can athletes find you, whether it be on social media, whether it be at your website? How can they find you?
Yeah. So I have Instagram and Twitter is Hunter Peaks. So those are great places. Also Peaks Coaching Group. So Peaks Coaching Group is our coaching business here. We have about almost 60 coaches now who work here at Peaks Coaching Group, and we've got clients all over the world from everywhere: Australia, Germany, China, Japan, Iceland. Just you name it. We've got clients everywhere. So we coach a lot of clients all over the world and a ton here in the U.S. So you can find us on Facebook, Peaks Coaching Group. Or you can look at me on Facebook as well, Hunter Allen. And, of course, check out our website, peakscoachinggroup.com. And that's a great place to learn about our coaching services and camps. We just finished our awesome fall camp here in Virginia just on Sunday. Just super fun, so beautiful. The leaves are just, the mountains are just orange, and we had a great time riding here. So we do camps all over the country and the world, and so check us out.
Yeah, and you guys got a full suite of coaching options, and you guys even have a consultative option where, let's say you got a race coming up, and you just need somebody who knows how to look at all this stuff, and you can get an hour with someone, right?
Yes, absolutely, and we do a lot of that. So if you just need, sometimes you just need a fresh face. Sometimes you need some of that objective feedback, and here's hey, what do you think about this? Or and a lot of people have read all of my books and other stuff and are great at looking at all this data and even planning some of this data and thinking about the next season, but maybe just need a little, hey, have a look at this. Am I on the right path or whatever? We do that. And then I've got, I've got over 100 pre-built training plans now that I've made over the last 15 years that are everything from 8 weeks to your peak, to improve your threshold in 8 weeks, to winter training, etc. And a lot of people will buy a training plan for $99 and then say, hey, you know what? I'd really like for it to be a little custom for me, so we can customize that plan for them with a consultation. That's a great way to do it as well.
Yeah, that's awesome, and I can attest that as a coach and then coming from being an athlete and a coached athlete, almost everything that I've learned about cycling, I've learned it from basically you guys, and I've always said, I wonder what Hunter Allen is saying about this. I wonder what Dr. Coggin is saying about this. And I will go out and I'll find out what you guys, or I'll go to my book. Like I said, I've had the second edition for years. And so you guys literally wrote the book on this stuff, and I am going to continue to learn from you guys. I will get the third edition soon.
Yeah.
And I highly recommend all of the listeners get it. I will put the link to the book on Amazon into the show notes so you guys can grab it. And all right, anything else that you want to say to our listeners before we go?
Oh, I think that we covered a lot of ground here, so that's been really great. And I think that the most important thing that when we think about all this training stuff is that it's nothing, it's still hard work, right? It's still training. And training, if you want to improve, you've got to put in that work. And sometimes that's the answer. And some of the athletes that I work with, the first thing that they see in their workout of the day is do the work. Maybe you don't feel great. Maybe you're not having that phenomenal day, but you know what? The athletes that win, the champions, the winners, they still do their intervals even when they don't want to. The winners are still winning, and that's that you get there through doing the work.
Right. Excellent. Hunter Allen, thanks for coming on to the podcast.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Tony.
What a great podcast guest. Thanks again to Hunter Allen for taking that time with me and discussing cycling and training with a purpose and training with a power meter. I felt like there's so much more that I could talk to him about, even going, 90 minutes or so. I felt like there's so much more that we can talk about, and that's the makings of a great podcast, when you feel like you just run out of time, and there's so much more that you can get into. And so maybe one day we'll have him back, or even have Dr. Coggin come on to the podcast. That would be amazing. I know many people would love to hear him on the podcast. And like I said, there's so much more that we can go into. We have some great podcast topics coming up. Just to give you a little preview, with all of the records that are being broken in the men's and women's marathon and half marathon, is there any good science that this performance is coming from footwear or new technology in footwear? So we'll dive into that. We'll also have a podcast on alternative therapies and treatments that are increasingly being sought out by athletes. Is there any efficacy in any of these treatments? We'll go into that. So if you're a new listener, welcome, and I hope you subscribe to the podcast, and I hope you enjoy it.
Follow Event Horizon Endurance Sport on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter for training programs and services. To become a member of our Endurance Institute or for a complete archive of podcasts, log on to our website, eventhorizon.tv.